Welcome, everyone. We're going to start with a presentation we gave to the Indivisible Illinois Leadership Group a couple of weeks ago about comparing the economy under Democratic and Republican presidents, and then we're going to go into our more typical monthly presentation. So, again, a big part of what we want to do is get you to understand the facts of and how to use those facts to make arguments and communicate to your audience, whether it be on Twitter, comments on a New York Times article, Facebook post, or what have you. Job growth is much faster under Democratic presidents than Republican presidents. The job data goes back to Truman, and you can see that even though Republicans have been in office for longer than Democrats, job growth is much higher under Democrats. And average monthly job growth is 164,000 under Democrats and 61,000 under Republicans. So over, 2.4 times higher. And if we look at it by president, we can see that job growth by month was highest under Clinton, and then Carter, and then Johnson, and Reagan, Nixon, Obama. And the negative job growth down there at the bottom of this chart is President Trump, because we're down about 3 million jobs since he took office. Along those lines, average annual real GDP growth is higher under Democrats than Republicans. We can see up at the top right that the average under Democrats is 3.7%. The average GDP growth under Republicans is 2.4%. So it's about 1.3% higher under Democrats. And you can see where the different presidents come in. You'll see that real GDP growth has been lower under the last 4 presidents than under any of the prior presidents. And the winners were in the 60s, Kennedy, Johnson, although Clinton in the 90s had very good real GDP growth. And Reagan and Carter were about the same. Why do we get these kind of results? Mostly because recessions happen and start with Republican presidents. 10 out of the last 11 recessions started under Republicans. The last Republican president who did not have a recession was James Garfield, who served 6 months back in 1881 before he was assassinated. So Republicans, are just unlucky with regard to always having recessions. One might think that it might have something to do with the policies that they enact. We can't quite figure out and exactly relate it to that. So we'll just go with their consistently unlucky. And then looking at the change in unemployment rate during presidencies, positive numbers are not good. What we see here is that the unemployment rate tends to go up under the Republican presidents, Reagan being the exception. His second term, the unemployment rate went down. And the unemployment rate tends to go down under Democratic presidents, the exception being Carter, where the unemployment rate was the same in January 1977 when he started, and January 1981 when he left office. Although if you remember from the earlier slide, average monthly job growth was higher under Carter than it was under Reagan. And now I'm going to let David continue to talk.
So this is the federal budget deficits have been lower under Democrats as a percent of GDP. So when you hear Democrats being criticized as being tax and spend or this and that, that blend of taxation and spending has kept deficits lower under Democrats at 1.6% of GDP, whereas Republicans had 3.5% of GDP budget deficits. So GDP is a measure of the size of the economy, and so this allows you to compare over time. And the historical average there, the black bar in the middle, 2.4%, gives you a reference point for historically, what's good or bad when it comes to a budget deficit. But clearly, the Democrats have lower budget deficits, and typically that's a good thing. But when the economy is in trouble like it is now, you do want to run a larger deficit. And historically, because the economy tends to go into recession under Republicans, as Carl said, recessions tend to drive the budget deficit up because the tax revenue falls from lower economic activity, but at the same time, the government tends to spend more on things like food stamps and unemployment insurance. And so recession usually indicates higher budget deficits. A stronger economy, you're usually going to have lower budget deficits. And as Carl mentioned, growth is better. The economy tends to be better under the Democrats. Generally, that helps the budget deficit and keeps it down. Next slide. Now, this is the change in the federal budget deficit under Democrats. So comparing the beginning and end of their administrations, Trump is now the defending champion. He inherited a very moderate budget deficit as a percent of GDP. And now this was an unusual year with all with the largest deficit we've had since World War II. We've had, a $3.1 trillion deficit in fiscal year 2020. So that's why this number is so large for him. Bush 43 also, at the end of his administration, was the Great Recession, and so he also had a very large increase. He inherited surpluses, and then the budget deficit became a large. Then the budget balance became a large deficit. So we went slight surplus to large deficit, and so that's why you got that large number for him. And then as you work down the line, again, you see the deficits tend to increase under Republicans, and they tend to decrease under Democrats historically. Next slide. Now, when it comes to spending, again, the Democrats get criticized for being for high taxes and high spending. But in fact, Trump and Reagan were the highest spenders as a percent of the size of the economy. And then Obama was third. When you do the averages, it works out that Republicans are actually the big spenders and higher than Democrats by about 1.5 percentage points. So it's a significant difference. And again, it goes back to this idea of the economy going into recession or worsening under Republicans, causing that spending to go up as they do it. Also, in some cases, deliberately high spending for defense or other things. But typically, again, Democrats are not the big spending party. We're lower than the Republicans. Next. Now, when you look at spending, how it rises or falls across the presidency now, you can see again, Trump's had spending jump enormously because of the relief package, mainly the CARES relief package earlier in the year. And then and Bush was right behind him. Again, the economy worsening from that surplus situation over to the end. But again, Republicans now average an increase of 3% in their spending, 3% of GDP, and then a reduction for the Democrats of almost 1% of GDP. And to put dollars on that, today's dollars, 1% of GDP is around $200 billion. So if the Republican spending is going up 3 points, 3 points of GDP, 3% of GDP, that's $600 billion in today's dollars. And for the Democrat, it's going down by almost 1% of GDP, so it's dropping by $200 billion. That's kind of give you a sense of it. The Bush tax cuts, those two, but also the Trump tax cuts are somewhere between 150 and 200 billion a year, so about 1% of GDP a year, to give you a sense of the size of that of an amount. But you can see here again, the Democrats are the ones that are lowering spending, and the Republicans are the ones that are increasing it during their presidency. Stock markets. Now, believe it or not, you would think that that based on how much Trump always talks about the stock market and how important it is, historically, the Democrats also have higher stock market returns. Again, likely a function of a better economy during the Democratic years. 11.2% annual increase in the Standard & Poor's 500 under Democratic presidents versus 6.9 under Republicans. And so that's a 4% percentage point a year difference. That's very significant. If you just compare those numbers, the Democrats the stock market's going up a third or a little bit more faster. It's quite a bit faster under the Democrats. Now, one of the questions is, well, why is this happening? I mean, why are the Democrats, as Carl put it, consistently lucky? You know, why are we fortunate to be have all these great economies? And it's not an easy analysis because there are so many variables involved. And the economist Alan Blinder, who's a former Fed chair, and his associate Mark Watson did the analysis, kind of like what Carl and I have done, going back they actually went back to the Truman years for the most part, the Truman second term. We've done a combination of Truman and Eisenhower. But what they said was we can exclude certain reasons, like the age and experience of the president wasn't a defining factor. Which political party controlled Congress didn't matter because the Democrats were outperforming regardless of who was in Congress. The quality of the economy inherited. Democrats tend to take over when things were more difficult. Fiscal policy. Democrats had lower deficits, and traditionally, you think of standard macroeconomics, if you run a bigger deficit, you should give a boost to the economy. That was a technique that Trump used. He cut taxes and boosted the deficit in his first couple of years and gave a boost to the economy. We had a trade-off of growth to some extent and higher deficits. It wasn't that. It wasn't monetary policy because interest rates were rising under Democrats, which usually hurts the economy and the stock market. Again, you can think of interest rates rising as being rewarded for being punished for your success. You know, as the economy gets stronger, interest rates tend to rise. And then changes in tax policy also not a reason for this outperformance by Democrats because Clinton raised taxes, Reagan lowered them, but both had really good growth. So it's not; those were things that they didn't think were defining or driving factors. Some of the reasons they gave. The Democrats had more benign oil shocks typically than Republicans. Productivity grew quicker under Democrats for whatever reason. Everybody was so happy there was a Democratic president that they were productive, more productive. I don't know. We don't know. More favorable international environment, you know, less wars, less strife with other countries. And then also consumers tended to be more optimistic during Democratic presidencies than Republican for whatever reason. So the conclusion that Blinder and Watson had was that they're not entirely sure. There were some factors that they could exclude, some that they thought were correlated, possibly causal with the Democratic success. But the moral of the story is Democrats are consistently outperforming on almost any important variable you can think of. The Democrats are doing much better, and it's not really even close on probably, in my view, the most important variable, which is job creation. Democrats 2.4 times faster job creation than Republicans, and that is probably, you know, again, as important a variable as you find when you do this sort of analysis. I believe that's the end of it, unless we snuck another one in there, Carl. I think that's the end of this presentation. We have a couple. Okay, here we go. We have a couple of scorecards that you can share on social media. These repeat some of the variables that we've already talked about. So you can share them all in one thing. It's easy to cut and paste this into Facebook or cut and paste it into Twitter. And, you know, it covers the job creation, real GDP growth, stock market, and budget deficits. The next page is the same idea. We just swapped out the bottom two variables to be the changes in the unemployment rate or the changes in the budget deficits, whichever variables you prefer. Both of those you can use, share with your friends, spread them around on social media, and explain how awesome the Democratic performance is. Here are some sources you can use. These are, all you have to do is you press Control and you click on them with your mouse and it'll bring up the site. I've put a lot of those sources into a Wikipedia article. It's titled down there, so you can go to Wikipedia and see this and see all the sources. I do check it regularly, and so far we haven't had a lot of vandalism, but also because a lot of people don't know about this article. It's new. So I've started linking it to other articles and spreading it around, but the more you can get this out there, the better. And, you know, Republicans love to say, oh, it's Wikipedia, blah, 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 but that's just because they're lazy. They don't want to go there and click on any of the actual sources. So if you run into that, what I recommend is the first source on there, The Economist, Timing is Everything, summarizes the second link up there, which is the Blinder and Watson study. So that really gets you, if you don't want to use Wikipedia, just link the Economist article at the top. It covers most of what the key points that Carl and I have covered here. And then I also created at the bottom a Twitter thread that you can just go to and share on Twitter or Facebook or anywhere else that goes through a lot of the slides in this presentation. So you can use all these as part of your social media arsenal to spread the word.